delight to be here. I mean, I said that before, I want to say it again. Especially because, you know, this is actually my first time. It may well be my only time. The reason for that is as much as I love Herodotus and as much as I would love to spend more time on the helpline, I have two young children, and this is exactly the time when I'm usually putting them to bed. So it's, fortunately, I managed to get at least the smaller one, who you saw just now, to bed a bit earlier today. For some reason, he was being cooperative. That never normally happens. So today, you know, I'm quite lucky. It's also really a great source of regret for me not being able to participate with a helpline before. And I just want to make one note before I start, and that's just, again, a shout out to my former student, Open University student Doris Post, who tragically was killed earlier this year. And I know that Jan has already shared this news with you, and you've had a meeting about that. And I'm just, you know, not only really upset about that, I'm so regretful that I missed Jan and Doris talking about Herodotus and Sophocles last year. You'll have learned that she had a great interest in ambiguity, and I hope that in some small way that this paper can honour her memory regarding that, because there's a certain degree of ambiguity that I want to tease out. I learned so much from her about Sophocles, and I hope that this paper can go some way to honouring her memory. There's just one other thing I wanted to add, that is, I've noticed with delight the number of papers in the Herodotus Helpline. Though I couldn't attend, I was keeping a beady eye on what was being discussed, and a lot of papers were reflective, looking back at previous publications, canonical publications especially. I would love to be able to do that, but lacking a canonical publication, what I thought would be kind of interesting would be to go back to a failure, where, if you like, I lost my spirit in a way, in a paper that I had tried to get published and it didn't work. And so I thought this could be kind of fun. Fun is maybe the wrong word, but interesting to go back to revisit that and to see what I can make of it now, 10 years down the line. So that's what you're going to find. You'll have received quite a lengthy handout. Don't be too scared, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but I thought it was quite helpful to give you some context at least, and I'm certainly happy to discuss anything on the handout. And I want to save time for proper discussion, so I'll aim to speak for about 45 minutes. I've just got some notes, so hopefully this isn't going to be too random and rambly, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And really, this is me consulting the helpline, phoning you up to see if you can help me with some of my struggles. And in particular, one word. That's really what this is about. One word, and how it may, or in fact may not be, Herodotus's, and what's at stake in the choices that we make about whether it is or isn't. And I want to use that one word, not liposuction, but liposuchia, to tease out issues related to reading Herodotus and aspects of such as aspects of intertextuality with Homer, and what we might mean actually by intertextuality, especially their use in Herodotus, contemporary influences on Herodotus, and possibly Herodotus's influence on later authors. So not much, and all being pressed on one word. So let's see how it goes. Here we go. This is the first passage I want to discuss. This is book 7, chapter 227. But of 2 of the 300, Eurytus and Aristodemos, it is said, though it is possible for both of them to have come to an agreement, either to get safely together back to Sparta, since they had been let go from the camp by Leonidas and were lying down at Alpeni in extreme suffering with ophthalmia, or if they didn't want to return, to die at the same time as the others, though it is possible for them to do either of these things, they were not willing to agree. But being divided in opinion, Eurytus, when he learned of the Persian circuit, demanded his armor, put it on, and ordered his helot lead him into the battle. And just so the helot led him there, and then himself fled. and Eurytus rushed into the crowd and was killed. But Aristodemus, with his spirit leaving him, was left behind. So I've translated there, with his spirit leaving him, this in the Greek Liposuchia. If you look at the translations of Liposuchia, so I've given you a selection there, and let's go to the PowerPoint there as well. We have arranged from Macaulay in 1890, Aristodemus was left behind fainting. I find particularly interesting the two godly translations, one in Perseus, one in Wikisource, significantly different, I think. Aristodemus, however, lost his strength and stayed behind, and that slips into Aristodemus's heart failed him and he stayed behind. To Waterfield's 1998 translation, faint-hearted Aristodemus, however, stayed away from the fighting. And finally, to Strasser 2007, which is more in keeping with my translation, but Aristodemus was left behind, faint and feeble. I particularly find interesting how the choice of how to translate Liposuchia also affects then your translation of Liptheni. So that Waterfield again, that faint-hearted Aristodemus, however, stayed away from the fighting, making Aristodemus active in staying away from the fighting rather than just being left behind. So we see here already a slippage in, again, as we all know, when you translate, you also are constructing an interpretive framework. And we see that that impact on some notable scholars and scholarship. So Marincola, for example, talking about Aristodemus returning to Sparta having saved his skin, or Deborah Bediger talking about how Aristodemus stayed away from the final struggle rather than going bravely and blindly, literally blindly, I think, to fight and die, as did his more right-thinking comrade Eurytus. I find that description of Eurytus being right-thinking particularly interesting, and I want to come back to that. And Foster, in another context, comparing Herodotus's description here to Thucydides, comes out when you consider how Liposuchia is used elsewhere. You get a hint of it in McCann, who talks about how Grote here renders it overpowered with physical suffering, but it's really the focus of Annalisa Paradisso's 2002 article, which really brings out, I think, the strangeness of this, of how people have been translating Liposuchia here as faint-hearted, or losing one's spirit, out of cowardice, as she puts it. So I want to pick up on a few things that Paradiso, I think, rightly draws attention to. The idea, for example, that in the whole of Greek literature, as she puts it in on page 165, note 6, its meaning is clearly associated with fainting that is in no way, that's in a physical sense and not in a moral or ethical sense. So I think that's one thing I want to dwell upon. And then also the emendation that she supports here, the emendation that instead of reading here to lose one's spirit, we should in fact be reading philosuchia, which is to love one's spirit, which certainly fits better that translation faint-hearted, that sense of loving your life so much. And Paradiso notes, I think, well, the connection to the Spartan ethical and political vocabulary here. And I've given you on a handout the specific reference here to Tyrtaeus, fragment 7. There also is maybe picked up in fragment 11, where Tyrtaeus talks about those running away. And you'll notice in the passage, again, something I want to come back to, the Spartans certainly interpret Aristodemus in these terms and call him otresas, the runner awayer, the trembler, as Ducat puts it. So I think there are three questions that I want to pick up on following Paradiso's, I think, quite right analysis that if we're going to use Liposuchia, we're translating it wrong, and as I said, in her opinion, we should be, in fact, amending that to Philopsechunta. So there are three questions I want to draw out. What is the semantic range of Liposuchia? I think Paradiso is right in that there's a consistency, but I think actually looking at the sources, both before Herodotus and those contemporary and after Herodotus, we can get a better sense of possibly its semantic range, and therefore how, if we want to choose, if we want to keep this word, how it might be working in the passage. What's the context for its usage in Herodotus' passage? And this is something I've really been struggling with, and I'm hoping the helpline can help me here. And considering both aspects, which is more likely in the end, the Liposuchia that the manuscripts give us, or this emendation Philopsuchia? How do either function in this passage? What's at stake in choosing either of these words? So, like I said, this isn't going to be a paper about one word, but I think it can really raise a lot of really interesting issues for Herodotean scholarship more generally. At least that's my hope. I'm going to take my cue from the Scholiast on the Iliad, where we get the mention of Liposuchia, where he relates it to a particular moment in the Iliad. And that's what I want to get to now. If I can organize my notes properly, let's see how we go. So this is what I want to do for very briefly. This is summarizing an article that I worked on that was published on Homer and the use of this particular idea of the spirit or the soul leaving the body in Homer, and a particular unit of utterance I want to come to in a second. But in any case, the notion of the soul leaving the body is perhaps not unsurprisingly in Homer related to death. The psyche here appearing to mean something akin to the life breath, perhaps even an etymological link between psyche and psychen, meaning to blow or to breathe. On the handout, you have some passages under passage 3. You have Achilles talking about life and death. This is famously in book 9, where he's articulating again really kind of what the situation is now and why he's not prepared to fight at this particular moment. And really what we get here a sense of this being a bannered declaration of mortality as being the human or heroic condition. I'm always risking my life, my psyche in war. So here you get a really close correlation, I think, between psyche and life. And a man's life, his psyche, cannot come back to him once it's past its teeth barriers. And I would say that this is really encapsulated in this unit of utterance. And this is really what I want to get to. Tonde lipe psyche, and his spirit left him. Now, every time this utterance is used, this unit of utterance in Homer is used, it's with a sense of death. The person's going to die. Apart from, interestingly, the first instance. And that's the passage you see on the PowerPoint, and it's passage 1 on the handout. Let me read it out. Then his godlike companion sat divine Sarpedon beneath a beautiful oak of aegis-bearing Zeus, and from his thigh, mighty Pelagon, who was his dear companion, pulled the ashen spear, and his spirit left him, and mist covered his eyes. But he breathed again, and Boreas' breath invigorated him after he painfully gasped for breath. Now, we don't only get tonde lipe psyche here, we also get kata dao dopthalamon kehura aculus. That is always used in a death context. It's always, in other instances, is always used for death, as is tonde lipe psyche. In fact, the next time we hear of that phrase, it's of Sarpedon dying. But here, we don't get that. So we get the sense, we get the suggestion of the death of the hero, but in this case, the departure of the spirit precisely does not indicate death. It's as if the psyche could pass the teeth's barrier and return again. And we get Sarpedon breathing again. He's not died after all. And you really see Homer working hard, I think, to keep his audience with him, the kind of repetition of his breath coming back to him. And this oddity is being noticed by one of the commentators on Homer's Iliad, Geoffrey Kirk. And that's again a passage I've given you on the PowerPoint here and on the handout. that formula flexibility can be confusing. That formula flexibility can be confusing is shown in this description of a warrior losing and then recovering consciousness. Since the soul leaving the body, this Liposuchia, normally implies death, and Kirk gives you here the other passages, as do I above. So there's a point, I think, by having Sarpedon die and then come back to life here, Homer's marking Sarpedon out as an important figure to the tale that he's telling. He recovers to die another day, as it were, to keep the Bond theme going. When the combination next occurs, it's used expressly to signify Sarpedon's death, as Hera warned Zeus off from saving his son, inviting him instead to look after Sarpedon's body once its spirit and years of life have left him. You get the repetition there of Liposuchia. This moment is all the more highly charged given at Sarpedon's early recovery, and serves to mark his death as the first important fatality in the Iliad's narrative. And in fact, that's not all. His death marks the beginning of a series of important fatalities. The other two, being the deaths of Patroclus and Hector, are connected not only logically, Patroclus' killing of Sarpedon leads directly to his own death at the hands of Hector, and so on, but also linguistically. The same couplet used for the deaths of both Patroclus and Hector reworks the collocation Lipe with Psyche for use in the death formula. And his spirit flew from his limbs to Hades, lamenting its fate, leaving manliness and youth. And the references are on the handout. So I did argue that with a skillful manipulation of its traditional referentiality, and this is again an idea I might want to come back to, Homer brings this hero's importance in this narrative to the attention of his audience. And we also see that happening with some other famous fainters in the Iliad, those being Aeneas, Hector, and Andromache. Fainting here being reworking the language of death. What I want to do very briefly, because I realize this is a Herodotus Helpline and not Homer, is just give you a brief up-to-date where we might think this idea of the soul leaving the body is when we get to Herodotus. So if you like, the afterlives of this Homeric collocation. First of all, the idea of Lipe Bisuke, this is on handout D. We see it in Pindar and Aelian, both meaning precisely this, basically death. And I give the other references here. And that finally brings us to this word that the scholiast had noticed. So the scholar had glossed ton de lipem psyche as lipopsychia. So that's the word that Herodotus is using, hence the connection that I wanted to draw to Homer. So lipopsychia, and we see it in, I would say, two traditions. There's first of all, if you like, the Hippocratic tradition, the Hippocratic corpus, where it can mean fainting. And we see this in the first example: if intense pain is present, continue until the loss of consciousness, afterwards administer an enema. It's not pleasant for the person, but they're not dead. This really just does mean fainting at this point. However, there are also instances where it slips into the idea that death is on its way, and that's the second example I've given you there. So he appeared to have lapses of consciousness. The signs weren't good. He said he wanted something under him, stared fixedly, resisted for a brief time, and then died. So you see here this use of the word liposuchia, preparing the reader for the idea, perhaps preparing the patient for the idea that they're going to die. Another interesting point I wanted to draw out finally is from the Hippocratic corpus, and possibly it's a kind of reception in Plutarch, is with Plutarch talking about bulimia here. He uses not only lipopsychia to mean fainting, but also lipothymia. That's again from a Homeric collocation, ton de lipe thymos, and that collocation only means death in Homer, in the Homeric poetry. So you see here again a Homeric phrase being reworked in a later context, meaning fainting, and again, interestingly, not only fainting, but can also lead to death, and there's some examples on the handout. And finally, the Aesopic tradition, if we want to call it this, I mean, also kind of lumping into that some comedy as well. Lipopsychia only means death. I'll give you one example: the bird catcher and the viper. The viper was enraged and bit the man. As he breathed his last, lipopsychon, the bird catcher said, "Woe is me, I was intent on stalking someone else, while I myself have been hunted to death," as Thanaton, by another. So all this is to say that Paradiso was correct, I think, in talking about Liposuchia as having a sense that's physical and not moral, unlike we saw those translations. But there are also important associations with death, especially in Homer. We also see with the Aesopic tradition. And I think it's interesting, of course, that Rosalind Thomas and Chris Pelling, and recently Leslie Kirk, Rosalind Thomas and Chris Pelling have talked about the Hippocratic influence on Herodotus, and Leslie Kirk recently has talked about the Aesopic influence on Herodotus. And we see both of those traditions possibly being present there with this word, if that's the word that, again, we'd want to read in that context. So finally, we're going to get on to Herodotus. And my question, the Homeric Herodotus, most Homeric or epic is the question. So just some background remarks, first of all, before we get stuck into our passage, because the Homeric aspect is very important for me, and it's something I want to argue, but I think we have to be a little bit more precise about what we mean by Homeric. And I know that in the past, certainly I wasn't very precise in what I meant by Homeric. So this is definitely revisiting this paper, certainly been very helpful for me in this context. So it's commonplace to talk about the Homeric aspects of Herodotus. Herodotus being the Homeriotatos, from Longinus is on the Sublime, the most Homeric. And under passage, this is passage E2 on the hand, I'll give you a list of aspects of the Homeric-Ness of Herodotus. For example, Kleos, it's a kind of big headline there at the beginning, in the prime of Herodotus, Kleos being so important to the Iliad. We think of Achilles singing Clea Andron, for example. But here it might be worth pondering, or Kleos surely would have been important for the epic tradition more generally, not specifically or only Homer, by which we mean the Iliad and Odyssey. And we do see a certain slippage, and like I said, I know I've been guilty of this. We do see a certain slippage with people talking about Homer when they, on the one hand, talk about Homeric, and then on the other hand, talk about epic or poetic even. We see that with Bodecker, for example, talking about epic coloring. John Marincola talking about the poetic use of Homer, and giving a couple of examples the audience must surely know their Homer here, where both of those examples could just be part of the traditional resonance, these traditional units of utterance that were kicking around in lots of all poems, not specifically the Iliad and Odyssey that we know. And Chris Pelling, it's always worth, he's going to appear quite a lot, actually, in this talk. As he puts it, it's easier to make and indeed to accept those grand generalizations and to be sure that Homer is what comes to Herodotus' listeners' minds every time he occurs to us. I think that's a very important point, and something I want to tease out a little, actually. And that's, let me just see where so first of all, let's think about what might Herodotus have known of our Homer. And here, this is handout E3. So I've given you a couple of passages there, one in character text where the Athenians appeal to the catalogue of ships as an assertion of their heroic stature. And also famously Herodotus in Book 2 using evidence from the Iliad as proof that Helen was in Egypt. Homer knew about this, but chose not to dwell upon that story in either the Iliad or Odyssey. So it does seem quite clear that Homer is aware, and Andrew Ford has discussed this in the 1997 article. It's quite clear that Herodotus knows the Iliad, whether it's exactly the same Iliad as ours. Again, I think that's open to debate, but enough of it at least. But we still need to, I think, bear in mind this acronym that Adrian Kelly has used in other contexts, not interestingly Herodotus, but other early Greek poetry, specifically Sappho and Archilochus, WYSIATI, or what you see is all there is. As he puts it, scholars are prone to filling in the gaps in our evidence by pretending there aren't any. In practical terms, this leads us to construct leads us to construct the literary history of the archaic period around the central pillars of the Homeric poems, and then to link those texts with every single other in the story of a development and literary influence familiar from a later stage of antiquity. So I think I need to be more careful, and when I'm using the description Homeric when discussing Herodotus, that's a more general point. However, I think Adrian also gives us a way out of this dilemma in a way, and this is his discussion of Stesichorus, where he notices a noticeable increase in the level and sustained nature of the Homeric interaction, a continuum of representations. And I give you the fuller quotation on the PowerPoint here. This suggests that Stesichorus had access to more than just a general knowledge of the poems, almost certainly to a written text, but also, and this is an important point for me, that the nature of the interaction is closer to the developed intertextuality of a later stage. Rather than merely showing knowledge of the Iliad and Odyssey, kind of the big bits, as it were, or invoking Homer as an authority figure, alluding to the big moments of the poems, Stesichorus seems to be engaging in a larger reading of their themes. It's kind of the thematic import, the true idea of intertext that's coming through here, in order to augment the semantic power of his own text. For the first time, we can see the audience is being encouraged to access large swathes of the poems and its details and actively apply them to the knowledge, to the current composition. And I would argue this is a very good description for how we can approach, how we can be more precise in what we mean by Homeric in Herodotus. Or as Chris Pelling puts it, again, those passages where Homeric touches are reasonably uncontroversial, either because they are particularly roistering or because they come in clusters. And that's going to bring us on to, we're almost there, we're almost to our passage. But first of all, Thermopylae. So this is, how did Chris put it? This, I think, is relatively uncontroversial, though Homeric, specifically Iliadic intertext here, the resonances with the Iliad, they're particularly roistering and they come in clusters. And I give you the clusters here. It particularly concerns Leonidas and the battle over his corpse, which really strongly recalls the battle over Patroclus. See, here we have, I think, an important intertext of this around a Thermopylae narrative, which perhaps is no surprise because, Thermopylae is a moment where East and West comes together again to fight. So of course the Iliad is going to be in the back, or we might think the Homeric poems or the epic poem tradition would be more generally in the background. But I would argue, because of the specific nature of these resonances, that we have the Iliad here in the background and the fight over Patroclus's corpse. And there were some really nice touches, such as Liz Irwin has done more than most, I think, to bring up the punning of Herodotus. And there's certainly a lot of punning relating to Leonidas' name here, the lion Leonidas, with playing around both generically with the idea of the lion simile in Homer. And as Chris Pelling notes, there's a lot of lion imagery in book 17 around the struggle over Patroclus' corpse, but also nice touches like the stele with the lion standing where the Greeks took their final stance. That echoes a stele that's mentioned in Homer in book 17, and the oracle that Leonidas gets, also talking about the lions. So we have here, I think, a really nice engagement, clear engagement between Herodotus' Thermopylae narrative and the Iliad, specifically the battle over Patroclus' corpse. And I just want to consider very briefly, because this is going to set up my reading of the passage, my problem passage. That is to think about what those resonances might be doing. And here I think it's again useful to bring out what Chris Pelling has talked about, how Leonidas is writing a script here. We get this in the first passage on the PowerPoint here. If he stayed here, Kleos mega, great Kleos would be left for him, and the prosperity of Sparta would not be wiped away. Kind of an echo of Herodotus' poem. And again, Herodotus is talking about it's in his opinion, that Leonidas, considering the oracle and wishing to win distinction for the Spartans alone, distinction, kleos better, sorry, wishing to win kleos for the Spartans alone, sent away the allies rather than have them leave in disorder because of a difference of opinion. So here we have kleos, Leonidas almost stage managing the kleos that the Spartans are going to get by fighting and dying at Thermopylae. And as Pelling notes here, in a microcosm of that proemial interplay of heroes and writer, Leonidas and Herodotus both have their roles in monumentalizing that kleos. One is doing, the other is describing. Leonidas and the Spartans are almost writing their own script, carefully ensuring that everything looks right. And here the nice point about combing their hair as a modern equivalent of the long-haired Achaeans. Now the kleos to be laid down is that of the Spartans. It's no longer a matter of just individual glory, but to be part of the group. And that's Pelling's continual theme here. Herodotus not just using Homer, but using Homer with a difference. So we get these Homeric touches, as Pelling would put it, but they're cast in a slightly different way. Here, the group aspect of kleos being very important. It depends on how we want to read munos, and that's a word I want to come back to, but in any case, I think the point stands that he's making. And this reminds me of Deborah Bodecker's 2003 article about the pedestrian aspect of Herodotus, where she draws a comparison between Herodotus, the narrator who's again constantly at our side, nudging us, and Homer's more monological narrative in the sense of the death of the hero being described. And Bodecker talks about Leonidas's death as more like the monologic heroic poetics of the Iliad. I think it's a very interesting observation, and perhaps something it's worth. I want to dwell on that because I think there might be a contrast with what's going to happen in our passage. So we get the sense of the Spartans writing their own script, Leonidas especially writing their own script, stage managing the construction of kleos, and kleos being there as something stable for the kind of Spartan memorialization. There are disquieting hints, the danger of the allies bickering already noted in this passage, the need to orchestrate possibly, suspicions of the Thebans Medizing, and also the form. And here I want to draw attention to John Marincola's article on the use of the first person in this section in the Thermopylae narrative and the discussion of alternative versions. Quite a typical Herodotean strategy, of course, possibly here unsettling this monumentalization of kleos. It's too long a word for me. Or Pietro Vanicelli's article about the Thespians being in danger of being written out of the story, where Vanicelli analyzes the epigrams that follow. The epigrams and the who's best, that section that we get after the Thermopylae battle narrative. So the Spartans are dominating, or possibly are seen to be managing, the post-battle memorialization, the praise of the Aristoi, the example of Dionysus' sayings, leaving behind a memorial, a minomosina, the inscriptions themselves, the casting of blame. And that's the passage I want to get to now. And really, this is coming up to the end of my talk. Yes, perfect. 10 minutes, I'd say. 1 second. This is apart from being invited by Jan, this is why I wanted to come and talk to you to help me with this passage. I mean, I'm used to Thucydides making my head hurt, but I find this particularly difficult to translate. The indirect speech, that monster clause, that first paragraph is one clause under legatai. It's all indirect speech, long sentences, lots of clauses and men there worth paying attention to. Again, if we're coming at this from a Thucydidean perspective, that's looking at the balanced or imbalanced nature of these clauses. We're supposed to dwell on this passage, I think, to worry about it and to compare this passage, the bit that comes after the battle, to the battle and all that tub thumping that we got before. And like I say, it's not dissimilar to Thucydides, this for me. And Homeric interplay, and specifically our word plays a role in this, I would argue. So, and what are we worrying about here? It's not coincidentally the idea of what to remember, who to remember, how to remember. Much more complex than Leonardus's gesture would seem to allow, perhaps. So, just some points I want to draw out regarding the passage. First of all, let's establish the, if you like, the Homeric aspects. So we have some Homeric words such as menis, onedos, and atimeia, so wrath and reproach or abuse and dishonor. These are words well discussed by Pelling again. Talks about how these Homeric themes are there, but again, they're there with a difference. We shouldn't simply talk of contrast, rather of more interesting interplays of the worlds of then and now. Pelling's point here is that these words initially, in Homer, in the Iliad, would be applied to Achilles. Achilles is the one with wrath. It's Achilles where we get the first use of onedos for abuse. Athena gives Achilles the license to abuse Agamemnon. And of course, it's Achilles who is dishonored. So these are very closely associated with Achilles in the Iliad. Here, with the interplay, as Pelling puts it, these are transferred to the Spartans as a group. So that, again, that idea of the collective now being at the heart of these very important Homeric words. I'll give you fuller references to these three words, menis, atimeia, and onedos. They definitely have an Achilles resonance. And here I think it might be better to talk about the resonance of these words rather than thinking of a specific passage in mind, because they're associated with Achilles at different points in the Iliad. But it is also interesting to note that there's another hero who is mentioned in this context regarding both atimeia and onedos, and in significant context, and that is Sarpedon in Book 12, where he calls upon Glaucus, why is it that you and I are honored before others? This is a very important passage, and subsequently in the Homeric tradition, and also regarding abuse. Again, to Sarpedon to Glaucus, this is when Sarpedon is dying. I will be a thing of shame and a reproach, an onedos for you, if the Achaeans strip my armor. So there's also potentially Sarpedon here in the background too, not just Achilles. And there are other Homeric words here, not just those three. There's also this really nice phrase when Aristodemus returned back from the battle alone, suffering pains. Munon Aristodemon algisanta aponistesai, the Spartan. These three words, munos, algos, and aponostesai, are again Homeric language, strongly resonant in both the Iliad and Odyssey. It's worth teasing out what they mean, who they're attributed to. Aponostesai, first use again, Achilles, interestingly, when he opens the debate. This is at a high point in the Iliad, right at the beginning. His first words are, I think we shall be, we'll have to go back home at this point because of what's happening in the Achaean camp with the plague. It's interesting that all instances of aponostesai, bar one, even though they talk about going back home, they're all negative. It's people who won't be going back home. So that's, I think, already an interesting tension here with Aristodemus, who's actually got back home. Algaea is quintessentially what it means to be a hero, particularly the Odyssean hero, of course, suffering many pains. But we also see it in the Iliad, Achilles talking a lot about his pain and suffering, actually. And munos is another important word. We already saw that before in relation to Leonardus wanting the Spartans alone to have their glory. Munos has a sense of, certain sense of exceptionality, of singularity, of vulnerability. And I think that also interestingly plays with the context we have here with Aristodemus making it back. So there's Homeric language in this passage, attributed, and that's doing some work about how we are thinking about Aristodemus. And there's, of course, also the structure. how Herodotus is setting this passage up. We have the typically, the usual things that we're all used to seeing with Herodotus, different versions, legatai speech, dokein moi, what it seems to me. I think the length and the subordinate clauses in this first passage especially is a little bit unusual, though, and that's why what I said before about wanting to dwell upon what's going on here and getting us to think a lot harder about it. But it is worth noting that this whole first passage is under the legatai clause, and the second passage is under the dokein moi clause. So it might be worth just reading out the translation again, if I can find it. Yeah. So this is the translation. So I'm going to read 229, but I'm going to read all the way through now to 232, which is, if you like, the sting in the tail. But of 2 of the 300, Eurytus and Aristodemos, it is said, though it was possible for both of them to have come to an agreement, either to get safely together back to Sparta, since they had been let go from the camp by Leonidas and were lying down at Arpeni in extreme suffering with Ophthalmia, or if they didn't want to return, to die at the same time as the others, though it was possible for them to do either of these things, and here we have Herodotus repeating pareion to make sure the reader's keeping up with him, they were not willing to agree. But being divided in opinion, Eurytus, when he learned of the Persian circuit, demanded his armor, etc. And he rushes into battle, gets killed, but Aristodemos, with his spirit leaving him, was left behind. We then get another story. We then get Herodotus's opinion. Now, if either Aristodemos alone had suffered many pains, and that's the Homeric resonance, I would suggest, and returned to Sparta, or if there's a rescue for both of them, it seems to me that the Spartans would not have imposed any wrath on them. But as it was, when one of them was dead and the other had the same prophesis, however you want to translate prophesis, motive, reason, and was not willing to die, they were compelled to be greatly wrathful with Aristodemos, or they felt compelled perhaps to be greatly wrathful with Aristodemos. Then 230, we get another story. Some say it was this, and others say, well, it was Aristodemos had been sent on a message from the camp and then lingered, and that's the reason why he didn't die. In any case, 231, when Aristodemos returned to Lacedaemon, he was abused and dishonored. This is again the Homeric language coming out in the mouths, being focalized with the Spartans. This was the manner of his dishonor. They wouldn't give him fire or speak with him, and they held him in abuse, calling him the runaway of Tresas, and that definitely seems to pick up on that Spartan ethical language from Tyrtaeus. 232 is the punchline, but he repaired all that was laid to him in charge in the fight at Plataea. So, how am I reading it? Well, there are, before getting to coming back to that punchline in this, I just want to draw out some of the unsettling doublets that I've already kind of gestured at here. First of all, there's a doublet, Eurytus and Aristodemos. They do different things. Then there are 2 accounts about Aristodemos not being in battle. Then Aristodemos is compared to another Spartan, apparently. So it's not just Aristodemos, but there's another guy, Pantites, who wasn't at the battle either, and he committed suicide. So he killed himself. And then finally, we get the Thebans and their general Leontiades. This is 233. And in this Leontiades, not Leonidas, this is no lion. His son will be leading the attack on Plataea that Thucydides describes in book 2, when the Thebans fought alongside the Spartans. So it's interesting how Herodotus ends all of this with the Mediaizing Thebans and an echo of what's going to happen later when the Thebans will be fighting alongside the Spartans. What does that do to Spartan memorialization efforts, I wonder? Opinion being divided, that's Eurytus and Aristodemos. Well, that picks up on the allies being divided, particularly focalized through Leonidas. It's the same couplet. Unwilling to agree, we get that repeated. First of all, the 2 of them aren't willing to agree. Then Aristodemos isn't willing to die. Leonidas, it is said to have cared about the allies, but Herodotus knows better. Leonidas sent them away because they were unwilling. So that sense of unwillingness doesn't just apply here to Aristodemos, but we can read back to that earlier passage too, when Leonidas is trying to establish Spartan kleos. And that sense of munos too. Leonidas planned to lay down the kleos of the Spartans alone. Munos now being picked up by Aristodemos. It's going to return actually with the Plataea passage. Right, so let me find my notes before I finish here. So what I think, bear with me, sorry. So with these doublets, we see Leonidas sending away the allies so the Spartans could win Kleos, and sending away 2 of the 300. And it's precisely because they make different choices that takes away from the Spartan Kleos. So in a way, it's no wonder that they're so angry at home. At an extreme, this could be almost seen as a death cult, and this maybe relates to Tyrtaeus. It's certainly extreme. Notice Herodotus' description of their extreme suffering, eschaton, with their eyes. And maybe that suggestion of this is a particular eye disease might also recall the description of Sarpedon, not only losing his spirit, but also the mist coming over his eyes. That could be a nice touch. That's pointed out to me by Ingilla Nielsen. So we have the Spartan policing of Kleos here. I think we only highlights in Herodotus' account the difficulty of keeping the story straight and on them. So I would suggest that this Liposuchia works rather nicely, both as a Homeric intertext, and we think of Sarpedon, and how Sarpedon will breathe again to fight and die another time. And that's exactly what's going to happen with Aristodemus. He's going to live and fight and die again, this time at Plataea. But we also see how Herodotus is using those thematic undertones, I think, in Homer. To bring out, so there's a contrast between how Leonidas is trying to construct Spartan memorialization and how the Homeric resonances are working in Herodotus' text. So after the somewhat tortuous exploration of Aristodemus' motives and Spartan condemnation, we get this one-line punchline. He proved himself at Plataea. So that flagging forward, I would argue, using the Sarpedon intertext here to remind us of the hero who can faint, but then prove himself to be a hero later on. And Herodotus making this important sorry, this is, I should have shown you this before, that was the doubling up. But in the Plataea narrative, Herodotus is very strongly expressing his opinion that by far the best of those who fought at Plataea was Aristodemus. Aristos here being again quintessentially from both Iliadic and applied to Achilles. So the Homeric intertext helps prepare for the shift, I would suggest, and in turn shows how difficult it is for the Spartans to control their memorialization in the mold of the Iliad. We already see that with Pelling's analysis of how those Homeric resonances tend to work from the perspective of the collective. But I think this is sharper. During the battle, the Homeric resonances bear out Leonidas' hope, as Bodecker showed, but there's a sting in the tail, and here we might think again of Marincola and Vannicelli's analysis. Typically Herodotean to give us these, to incorporate these competing logoi and provide a narratorial judgment on them. That's the work of history, that's the work of the histor. And in this passage, I suggest he's getting us to work like the histors as we pick our way through the evidence. Not only what happened, at Thermopylae, but also why it's important, how we interpret that, how we remember it, how we think about it. So we have, I think, Herodotus having his cake and eating it. We get the glorious death in Thermopylae. I mean, I don't want to detract from how inspiring, you could say, the story of the Spartan last stand at Thermopylae is in Herodotus, but we also get these undercurrents that chip away at that, particularly the idea of it's not the 300. It's, you know, it's the 300 minus 1, or maybe it's minus 2. So there's that chipping away that so upsets the Spartans, because they're not able to the 300, as I think it's, yes, exactly. This is ducat, much better than my rambling here. Why anger? I would say that it was basically because Aristodemus reduced the number of the heroes from 300 to 299, which is much less satisfactory. It spoils the Spartan claim to uniqueness, that zero default. And further, one might also ask whether this kind of, you know, explicitly pose another question, one more disturbing, whether it was the right choice that Leonidas made for the city and for the Greeks.